And the paper crackled when you unrolled it. Not the thick crackle of cardboard, not the soft rustle of newsprint, but the specific thin complaint of blueprint paper under tension. A sound that existed at the precise intersection of fragility and precision that told you immediately this was not casual material. You held the corners down with whatever was heavy enough and small enough to serve a C-clamp, a jar of model cement, a wood block from the scrap pile, while the rest of the sheet settled onto the table. Then you leaned over it, and the drawing was dense with information. Every rib was shown from 2 angles. Every spar was dimensioned. The fuselage formers were drawn with their notches precisely positioned, each notch labeled with the part that would eventually occupy it. And the relationship between all these notches, the 3-dimensional structure of the aircraft emerging from the flat geometry of the plan, was something you had to hold in your mind simultaneously with what your hands were doing at the building board. This was the Berkeley Models blueprint, and it was not asking you to assemble something. It was asking you to understand something. The distinction was total. The balsa was in the box beneath the plans. You had already felt it through the cardboard before you opened the kit. The specific lightness of good balsa, which is not merely low density, but aeronautically calibrated. The material of the aircraft industry available to you in a small cardboard box for the price of a few hours of lawn mowing, or whatever work a kid did in 1948 or 1950 to generate the discretionary income that made a Berkeley kit possible. And inside the box, sheets of die-cut parts, a packet of silk-span tissue, thread for the wing struts if the design called for them, a handful of small metal pieces for the hardware, the pushrod guides and wing hold-down bolts and other small precision components that the kit supplied because they could not be improvised. The smell of fresh balsa, which was always the first thing, dry and faintly sweet, a smell that had no counterpart in the adult world of lumber or construction materials. A smell that belonged entirely to craft and to the particular precision that craft aspired to. You sorted the die-cut sheets onto the table beside the blueprint. You identified the first parts you would need, which the instructions indicated, and you confirmed them against the numbers stamped into the die-cut outline. Then you picked up the razor blade or the sharp knife and began. If the memory of that specific moment, the blueprint spread, the balsa ready, the evening ahead of you, and the aircraft not yet begun, live somewhere in your memory. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, not for the algorithm, but so stories like this don't vanish in the way that most things vanish, which is gradually and then completely without announcement. What Berkeley Models produced and what the culture that received it understood about the making of things deserves a record. William L. and Effinger Jr. was a Brooklyn boy with an engineering disposition and a specific problem. He needed money for college. He was admitted to Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute, where he intended to study mechanical engineering, and the gap between his family's means and the tuition demanded a solution. He was also, since he was a boy, obsessed with model aircraft, with the specific intricate pleasure of making a thing that could fly, of understanding through the making what made flight possible. These two facts about himself, combined in a way that he probably did not initially anticipate, would define his professional life. In 1933, he founded Berkeley Models in a 3-car garage at 53 Berkeley Place in Brooklyn. The name came from the address. The address belonged to his family, and the garage belonged to the address. The operation was minimal in the way that all genuine enterprises begin. One person, one space, one idea, and the willingness to turn the idea into something that other people would pay for. He began by advertising classified ads in Universal Model Airplane News, a publication whose readership was precisely the population he needed to reach. People who were as obsessed with model aircraft as he was and who would recognize immediately in the right product at the right price, something worth having. His first rubber-powered kits appeared in 1934, the Consolidated Fleetster and the Fokker triplane. These were not toys in the casual sense of the word. They were scale representations of real aircraft. The Consolidated Fleetster was the 9-passenger monoplane that had set a speed record in 1930. The Fokker Dr. I was the famous triplane of the First World War that had carried Richthofen and other German aces through the skies of France and Belgium. Effinger was not making simplified models of complex aircraft. He was making accurate models of those aircraft at a scale that could be built from a kit, which meant that every design decision in the kit was a decision about what accuracy required and what the builder could reasonably be expected to accomplish with the materials and tools available to them. The following year, he produced what is credited as the first gas engine-powered model airplane kit in the history of American aeromodeling, the Buccaneer. This was a significant moment in the hobby's technical evolution. The model aircraft hobby in 1935 was in the process of transitioning from rubber power, limited flight duration, limited performance, the elegant constraint of storing energy in twisted rubber strands, to the glow and spark ignition engines that would define the post-war era. The Buccaneer was Berkeley's entry into this new world, and its success was substantial enough that the design would eventually be kitted in 9 different sizes for different power sources, spanning the range from small rubber-powered versions to large gas-powered configurations that required serious engine technology. By November 1935, Effinger was advertising 6 kits in his Master Models series, scale design kits, with 20-inch wingspans in full display advertisements rather than the classified ads with which he had begun. And by 1936 came the Cavalier with a 9-foot wingspan, a scale model of genuine ambition, requiring a building space large enough to accommodate it and a builder skilled enough to complete it. Effinger graduated with his mechanical engineering degree from Brooklyn Polytechnic in 1938 and made Berkeley his full-time career, at that point, which represented either confidence or commitment, or both, and which proved to be justified by the company's trajectory over the following decades. What he was building from that Brooklyn garage was not merely a model airplane company. He was building a system of knowledge transmission, a mechanism for taking the engineering principles of aircraft design and making them accessible to people who had not studied engineering formally, but who had the patience and the attention to work through the plans that Berkeley produced and arrive, at the end of the process, at a genuine understanding of why aircraft worked the way they worked. The world that received Berkeley kits in the decades after the Second World War was a world that understood collectively something that our era has largely forgotten, that making a thing yourself was not merely an alternative to buying a finished thing. It was a different experience entirely, producing different knowledge, different satisfaction, and a different relationship to the made object. The father who built a Berkeley kit with his son at the kitchen table in 1951 or 1955 was not improvising a cheaper version of a purchased toy. He was providing an education that was not available through any other means, an education in materials, in structure, in the relationship between design intention and physical result, in the patience that complicated physical work requires and rewards. The mail order catalog was the primary means through which this education was distributed geographically. Berkeley, like every other model kit manufacturer of the era, existed in the physical world through the hobby shop where you could see and touch the kit boxes, and in the national world through the classified and display advertising that appeared in the model aviation magazines, air trails, model airplane news, flying models, and through the catalog that Berkeley mailed to anyone who asked for it. The catalog was a document of aspiration. Every kit listed with its specifications, its power requirements, its wingspan, the scale of the original aircraft it represented. You could spend an evening with it, you could plan. And the plans themselves, the full-size blueprints that Berkeley included with its kits, were the material expression of a philosophy that Effinger never stated explicitly, but that was present in every design decision, that the person building this aircraft deserved to know everything about it. The Berkeley blueprint did not assume that the builder would trust the kit, and it invited the builder to verify the kit, to confirm, by reading the plan, that every part was where the plan said it should be and was oriented the way the plan showed it should be oriented. This was not an unusual expectation in the engineering culture that the Second World War had trained into a generation of Americans. It was the expectation of someone who had read an engineering drawing and knew what engineering drawings were for. The scale in which Berkeley's blueprints were drawn was a specific statement about the company's intentions. Full-size plan, one in which the dimensions on the paper corresponded to the actual dimensions of the aircraft being built, required the builder to do nothing more than lay the die-cut part on the paper to verify that it corresponded to the drawing. There was no scaling factor to apply, no calculation required. The plan was the aircraft, projected flat and cut from balsa, and the relationship between them was immediate and legible. This was not a simplification of the engineering for the benefit of an unskilled audience. It was the correct engineering approach to communicating a construction process. Make the information as direct and unambiguous as possible. Leave as little room as possible for interpretive error. What the plan also provided was authority. The builder who had read the plan was the authority on whether the aircraft had been built correctly, not the kit manufacturer, not the hobby shop counterperson, not any external arbiter. The builder who had compared every part against the plan and confirmed its position and orientation against the drawing was the person who knew whether the aircraft in their hands was correct. This transfer of authority to the builder was not accidental. It was the consequence of a documentation system designed to make the builder fully informed, and it produced builders who had confidence in their own judgment because their judgment had been grounded in the specific evidence of the plan. The hobby shops of the period were the social spaces through which the blueprint culture expressed itself. Will Run Hobby Shop in 1955 or 1962 was staffed by a person who knew the Berkeley catalog and could tell you which kits were appropriate for which skill level, which engines the larger designs required, and where to obtain them, which materials were necessary beyond what the kit supplied, and in what quantities. The counterperson was the intermediary between the manufacturer's knowledge and the builder's need. And the relationship was educational in the specific way that useful knowledge freely shared is educational. It produced capability in the recipient that they did not have before the conversation. The building ritual of a Berkeley kit had a sequence that the plan dictated and that the builder learned to follow as naturally as learning to read follows the left-to-right progression of the page. And the fuselage came first in most designs, because the fuselage was the structure around which everything else organized. You pin the fuselage plan to the building board. a flat board of soft wood into which the T-pins would penetrate easily, over which you had laid the plan paper, over which you had laid the wax paper that prevented the structure from bonding to the plan in the places where the glue overflowed the joint. The formers came first. The plywood or hard balsa bulkheads that established the fuselage's cross-section at regular stations along its length. Each former had notches that received the stringers, the longitudinal members that ran from nose to tail and connected the formers into a three-dimensional structure. And gluing the formers to the stringers was a process of checking and double-checking. Were the formers square to the center line? Were they plumb? Was the assembly free of twist? The building board and the plan together answered these questions if you use them correctly, which meant checking each step against the plan before proceeding to the next one. The wing was the center of the project in every sense. And the wing was where you spent the most time and where the most critical structural decisions lived. Each one a thin slice of balsa cut to the airfoil profile, shown on the plan, had to be mounted on the spars in precisely the right position and angle, because the wing's aerodynamic character was entirely determined by this geometry. Installed slightly off angle produced a wing that pulled to one side. A rib installed at the wrong position moved the center of pressure and changed the wing's balance. These errors were correctable through the trim adjustments available on the finished model, but they were better prevented than corrected, and preventing them required reading the plan carefully before installing each rib rather than trusting that close enough was adequate. The balsa variation. This was one of the things that the serious Berkeley builder learned to navigate. The die-cut parts in a kit were made from the balsa that was available when the kit was packaged, and balsa's density varied naturally within the species, producing wood that ranged from very soft and light to harder and denser within what appeared to be the same material. The experienced builder sorted the parts before beginning construction, feeling each rib between fingers to assess its stiffness, grouping the lighter density parts for the locations where weight was most critical, using the denser parts in locations where strength mattered more than weight. This sorting was not specified in the instructions. It was a practice that the builder developed through experience, or was taught by a more experienced builder, or figured out on their own through the specific education of building models that flew incorrectly and diagnosing why. Cover with silkspan. The silkspan tissue that Berkeley included with its kits was a specific material, a tissue reinforced with a sparse silk fiber structure that gave it tensile strength in the longitudinal direction while remaining translucent in the way that the doping process required. You cut the silkspan to shape, applied it to the structure dry, and secured the edges with dilute dope butyrate, dope thinned to about 50% with acetone, applied with a small brush, which bonded the tissue to the balsa at the edges without stiffening the body of the tissue. Then water misted over the surface, the tissue tightening as it dried, shrinking slightly against the structure, taking on the shape of the ribs beneath it. The smell of dope was pervasive and specific. Butyrate dope, the aircraft dope that Berkeley's designs required, had a chemical sharpness that no contemporary common material quite replicates. A sharpness that said functional chemistry is happening here, not decoration. The doped surface, when it had dried through successive coats, was taut and resonant. You could tap it with a fingertip and feel the drum-tight tension of a properly prepared surface. This was not finish for its own sake. It was the structural skin of the aircraft, contributing to the wing's torsional stiffness, sealing the surface against the passage of air that would disrupt the laminar flow the airfoil depended on. Then paint. The doped surface accepted paint typically dope-compatible paints, thin to spray or brush application, in a way that preserved the translucency if you chose transparent colors, or produced an opaque finish in the solid colors that the scale markings required. The scale markings of a Berkeley design, the roundels, the national insignia, the aircraft number, the squadron markings, were applied over the painted surface, either by hand with a small brush and reference photographs, or with the commercial decals that Berkeley provided in the later kits. In a well-finished Berkeley model, in the hands of a builder who had taken the time and developed the skill, was a visual document of the aircraft it represented. The engine run before the maiden flight was its own ritual. The Berkeley kits that specified engine power required specific engines, McCoy or Fox or Enya, or the other engines of the era that the plans had been designed around, and the engine had to be run on the ground before the model was trusted to the air. The needle valve adjustment, the break-in procedure, the confirmation that the engine would hold a consistent RPM through the run and would not quit or surge on the first climb. These were the mechanical disciplines of powered free flight or control line, and the builder who had attended to them completely was the builder whose model flew correctly on its maiden attempt. The first flight of a Berkeley scale model was an event in which the quality of everything that had preceded it was tested simultaneously. The CG which you had balanced against the plan's specified location. The wing symmetry which you had verified by measuring the distances from the wingtip to the fuselage centerline. The control surface throws which you had checked against the manual specifications. The trim which you had adjusted in the glide test before committing to powered flight. And all of these things were correct, or they were not. And the first flight would tell you which without sentiment. A Berkeley model that had been built correctly flew the way the plan's aerodynamics implied it would fly. The model that had not been built correctly flew the way the errors in construction implied it would fly, which was informative in its own way, informative about what you had gotten wrong and what you needed to do differently next time. The free flight model presented its own discipline after the flight began. Once launched, the control line model remained under the pilot's authority through the mechanical link of the wires. The free flight model was on its own, and the builder's influence on its flight was complete at the moment of launch, determined entirely by the trimming decisions that had been made on the ground. Watching a correctly trimmed Berkeley free flight model climb in its spiral pattern, the DT timer counting down, the model reaching altitude and then triggering the dethermalizer that collapsed the tail and brought the model down in a controlled descent, was the specific satisfaction of workmanship confirmed by physics. The model did what the physics said it should do, because you had built it to the geometry that the physics required. The Berkeley identity was not simply about skill level or price point or any single design characteristic. It was about a philosophy of what the customer was owed when they bought a model kit, and what Effinger believed, what the company's designs embodied from the first rubber-powered kits of 1934 through the last period of production in the early 1960s, was that the builder was owed accuracy. The plan was accurate to the original aircraft. The parts were accurate to the plan. And the instructions were accurate to the construction sequence that produced the best result. This was not a luxury service. It was a baseline standard, a statement that the person building the kit deserved to have the information they needed to do the job correctly. The designs that Berkeley commissioned from outside designers reflected the same standard. Chuck Hollinger's J3 Cub design, which Berkeley kitted and which became the basis for what is now marketed by SIG Manufacturing as the SIG J3, one of the few living descendants of the Berkeley Lions. Steve Whitman's Buster Racer, scaled to a kit that preserved the racing aircraft's distinctive geometry and models of the P-51 Mustang, the P-38 Lightning, the Stearman Cadet Trainer, the aircraft of the Second World War, and the immediately post-war era, the aircraft that the men who were fathers and grandfathers in the 1950s had flown or maintained or fought against, each one given the scale treatment that Berkeley's reputation demanded. The quality problems that emerged in the late 1950s and early 1960s were the beginning of the end, and they began with balsa. Berkeley, like every kit manufacturer of the period, depended on balsa of consistent quality. The specific density range that made balsa useful for model aircraft, neither so soft that it offered insufficient structural integrity, nor so dense that it added excessive weight. When balsa of this quality became scarce and expensive, the response was a decision that any cost accountant could defend and that any serious builder would recognize as fatal. Reduce the quality standard use, lower grade balsa. The experienced modelers who had been buying Berkeley kits for a decade noticed immediately. The parts were not right. The weight was not right. The structure that the plan specified could not be built correctly from parts that did not have the properties the plan assumed. This is a specific kind of institutional failure, the kind that happens when a company loses touch with the thing that made it valuable. Not a dramatic failure of strategy or management, but a quiet erosion of the standard that the market had trusted. The serious builders who had relied on Berkeley moved to other sources or began ordering balsa by the sheet from suppliers who could guarantee the grade. The less serious builders who had not developed the sensitivity to recognize the decline continued to buy Berkeley kits, but the kits they built did not fly as the earlier kits had flown, and the experience did not produce the same satisfaction. And the hobby lost recruits who might have become serious builders if the first experience had been what the Berkeley reputation had promised. And by the early 1960s, Berkeley Models had effectively ceased production. The red, black, and white kit boxes that had been a fixture of hobby shop shelves for nearly 3 decades disappeared from the shelves. The company that had produced what may have been the largest number of distinct kit designs of any American model airplane manufacturer, approximately 150 different designs across the range from tiny rubber-powered models to large gas-powered scale aircraft, was gone from the active market. The Hobbico acquisition of various hobby brands through the 1980s and 1990s did not rescue Berkeley. The name survived in the same way that some names survive acquisitions, preserved in archives and collector circles, and the memories of the people who had built the original kits, but not as a living manufacturing enterprise producing new designs and maintaining the standard that Effinger had established. And the Berkeley archive that exists today lives primarily in the Academy of Model Aeronautics Museum collection, in the hands of collectors who have preserved kit boxes in good enough condition to build from, and in the specific memory of the people who built Berkeley kits when they were current and who carry that experience as a reference point for what the craft was capable of. The forces that changed the world that Berkeley occupied did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. They arrived in the way that cultural shifts always arrive, gradually accumulating pressure until the accumulated pressure exceeded the system's ability to absorb it. The almost ready-to-fly category was the most direct commercial challenge. The pilot who wanted to fly model aircraft and not build them had always existed as a potential customer, but the kit era had no practical product for them beyond the simple, inexpensive models that required minimal construction. The ARF changed this by offering aircraft that arrived from factories in states of near completion, requiring only the installation of radio and engine equipment and a few hours of final preparation. For the pilot who wanted to be at the field on Saturday and was not interested in spending the preceding 3 months at the building board, the AIRF was a genuine service. What the AIRF could not provide was the knowledge that the building process delivered. This is not an elitist statement about purity or authenticity. It is a practical observation about the relationship between process and understanding. The pilot who had built the aircraft from a Berkeley blueprint knew every structural member in it. They knew where the main spar was located, relative to the ribs and why. They knew the size and position of the fuselage formers and the angle at which the tail surfaces met the tail boom. They knew these things because they had put each piece in place with their own hands, had verified each position against the plan, had developed through the construction process an understanding of the aircraft's internal logic that no amount of flying a pre-built model could substitute for. The foam revolution followed the ARF revolution and completed the displacement of the building culture and expanded polystyrene foam, and later, the proprietary expanded polypropylene formulations developed by companies like Multiplex produced aircraft that could be manufactured at a fraction of the cost of balsa construction, that were crash resistant in ways that balsa was not, and that required no building skills beyond what was needed to connect the preformed components. The foam aircraft was not inferior to the balsa aircraft in flight performance. In some configurations, it was superior because modern aerodynamic design and electric power systems had advanced beyond what the older glow engine balsa tradition had optimized for. It was a different thing that the foam aircraft represented, not a worse version of the same thing. The hobby shops that had been the social and commercial infrastructure of the building culture contracted steadily from the 1980s onward. The large mail-order retailers, Tower Hobbies, Hobby Lobby in its original form, changed the economics of distribution. The internet completed the disruption, and the independent hobby shop, which had been the place where the blueprint culture lived during the week, where the Berkeley catalog was stocked, and the experienced counterperson knew what you were building and what you needed, and what to do when it wasn't working, became increasingly rare. The question that the Berkeley story poses cannot be answered by the story of one company's rise and decline. It is answered, or at least illuminated, by the question of what kind of knowledge the building process produced, and whether that knowledge is being produced somewhere else, in some other form, by the culture that replaced the building culture. In building, from a blueprint, required reading engineering drawings, understanding how a three-dimensional object is represented in two-dimensional projection, how the front view and the side view and the top view relate to each other and together describe a solid object. This is a specific and transferable skill that engineers and architects and machinists and designers use every working day. It is not universally taught in schools. It was commonly learned for a generation of American men and some women at the building board over a Berkeley or Commit or Scientific or Sterling kit, in the evenings and on weekends, without anyone calling it engineering education. Building, from a blueprint, required material judgment, the ability to assess a piece of balsa by its weight and its stiffness, and the sound it made when tapped, and to make an informed decision about where in the structure it belonged. This is the same judgment that a carpenter uses when selecting lumber, that a chef uses when selecting ingredients, that any practitioner of a physical craft uses when working with natural materials, whose properties vary within the category. And it is learned through practice, through handling many pieces of the material, and developing the sensitivity to feel the difference between good and adequate and insufficient. building from a blueprint required the practice of patience, the specific discipline of returning to the building board evening after evening, making incremental progress through the stages of construction, resisting the shortcuts that each stage offered, understanding that the quality of the finished aircraft was determined by the quality of every decision made in its construction, and that each decision counted. This patience was not merely useful for building model aircraft. It was formative in the way that deliberate, sustained engagement with a complex task is always formative. It built in the builder the understanding that difficult things are possible if they are approached correctly and patiently, and that the difficulty is not an argument against the attempt. If you built a Berkeley kit, if you spread a blueprint across your workbench late at night with the building board ready and the knife sharp and the balsa sorted, leave your memory in the comments. Not as nostalgia for its own sake, but as testimony. The record of what that experience gave to the people who had it is not preserved in any institution's archive in the form that it needs to be preserved. Not as fact, but as felt experience. Not as historical account, but as living memory. And the people who carry it are the archive. What you remember is the record. Return to the blueprint. It is still on the table, held flat at the corners by the C-clamp and the jar of model cement and the woodblock from the scrap pile. The light in the room has not changed. The smell of balsa has not dissipated. The evening is still ahead. The balsa sheets are sorted beside it. The first parts have been identified. The building board is ready. Wax paper in place. T-pins at hand. The evening is ahead. The aircraft in this blueprint has not been built yet. It exists entirely in the drawing, in the ribs shown from two angles, in the spars dimensioned, in the fuselage formers with their precisely positioned notches, in the three-dimensional structure that the plan contains in potential, and that the builder will bring from potential into actuality through the specific patient work of the coming evenings and weekends. And it is asking to be built. It has been designed to be buildable. Every decision in the design assumes a builder who will read the plan, who will follow the sequence, who will verify each part against the plan before gluing it in place, who will develop through the doing of each step a concrete understanding of why the step works. This is what the Berkeley blueprint was, not an instruction to assemble, an invitation to understand. The distinction is between passive execution and active engagement, between following and knowing, between arriving at a finished aircraft and becoming, through the process of building it, someone who knows what the finished aircraft is and why it works and what it would take to make it differently. When Berkeley Models closed, the blueprints were archived, some of them preserved in the Academy of Model Aeronautics Museum collection in Muncie, Indiana, where they exist as historical documents alongside the other artifacts of American aeromodeling history. The die-cut balsa sheets aged in their boxes in attics and hobby shop, back rooms, and the storage units of collectors who understood what they had. The knowledge that the blueprints transmitted is still available to anyone patient enough to seek it. The archived plans, the collections of people who built in that tradition, the surviving kits that can still be completed by a determined builder with the skill and the time and the specific willingness to do something the difficult way, because the difficult way is also the way that teaches. The blueprint is on the table. The balsa is waiting. The question is not whether the aircraft can still be built. The question is whether we still believe it is worth building.